Yeah, another suggestion. Can we add into agenda templates that if you add yourself, you agree with recording to be recorded? In that case, yes, we can set up after recording in Zoom. I also set up it for GraphQL over HTTP and it's working. But I think we need to add into agenda template. And about agenda, I add another items as pull request about deprecated directive on arguments and input values. I ask original author to join, but I don't see him on an agenda. And yeah, so.
Oh, I see your pull request. Let me merge that in and we'll include that today.
Yeah, I think it's pretty short and I don't want to block it. So we can discuss it in the end.
Great, I put it at the end. And we're also recording now, so we'll have that ready. Thanks so much for bringing that up.
Hi, everybody. I also added a small PR just now to discuss quickly full Unicode support. Quick one.
Awesome. Yeah, I see it. I'm going to add that one in as well. 1 second while I merge. And welcome, Andy, by the way.
Thank you and good morning.
Okay. Committing merge. I don't know if you guys can hear kids in the background at home taking this call. You might hear them from time to time. All right, let's see if we've got. All right, cool. Pull requests are clean. So if you refresh your agenda, you should see an up-to-date list that includes all of those. Okay, that's a lot. So let's just jump right into it. I'll hand it off to Matt to talk about custom scalars.
Great. Not a lot of updates since last month. It's been rebased off of the V1500 RC2 branch. One question did come in from someone at Shopify, so I don't know, Evan, if you've talked to them, about whether we wanted to have any validation in the reference implementation of the URLs that are being sent in. I think Evans had like the best memory of this, was that like we kind of said that the definition of what a URL is clear enough, and that we didn't need to get more specific than that, and that we also didn't need to have a validation of that in the reference implementation. And so I think that's what we previously decided. I think it's open for discussion if we want to change that approach, either by making it more specific in the spec that it should be referenced in RFC that it should comply to, or if we want to add validations into the reference implementation.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I think it absolutely makes sense that this is something that the reference implementation should validate. Whether we require that of other implementations is, I don't know, I don't feel strongly.
I guess my question is, what value will that add beyond the pedantic correctness?
The one place I could see it having an impact is if like a tool like GraphQL is going to be consuming this and they want to turn that into a clickable URL and it's not a valid URL, then we're pushing that work on to the multiple clients that can be consuming this. I don't know if that's a strong enough justification to do it or not, but that's the one case I saw for it.
I mean, that seems like a good reason enough to me, but.
What would the rule be? That the validation would be that it has to match a certain spec of URL?
Yeah, there's an RFC, there's an IETF RFC for what a URL is, and we can just say like it should be one of those, and then the server implementation should validate that it is one of those.
Yep. Yeah, that's pretty standard.
That's actually a very recursive thing. What we're trying to do here, because like passing a URL is non-trivial, and you would expect that you put up a custom scalar which references a spec, and now you want to put in the URL passing inside the spec as a precursor to custom scalar. So like the custom URL parsing is non-trivial, so you will end up with incompatible implementations across boards, and I'm not sure the value is really there, to be honest. Like if the URL is not clickable or it doesn't open in a tool, then be it. But like in general, as a common understanding, I think it's enough to say it should be in URL. My 2 cents.
I think I agree with Andy on this point. I think I'll point to the precedent that if you put a malformed URL into an A tag, that the page still renders and you can still click it and it'll just, not particularly load a page because it's a malformed URL, but like it lets you get pretty far. The reason why I brought up the adding value is, as we've discussed it so far, my understanding was that the fact that it's a URL actually is only really useful that you can, like a human can go click it and understand what it means. But as far as tools matter, or as far as tools care about this, it's really just an opaque string. It's an opaque identifier that says, like, if you see this particular unique string, then you can imbue this custom scalar with these known types.
This is true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So,
and even if it was a URL that is a legal URL, that doesn't mean that there is a web server serving that. You won't necessarily be able to click on it.
True. Yeah, maybe we should add DNS resolution into the reference implementation. Just joking.
Point made, I think.
Yeah. I don't feel super strongly. I wanted to be the voice of simplicity.
On the principle of we can always add it in later if it becomes a problem, like I'm fine to leave it out for now and see if it actually becomes an issue in the wild of people doing stupid stuff with the string field that are not what we intended.
That's true. I think you're right. And I also think the power of these specified by URLs really only start to, they only start to become powerful once servers and clients agree. So you can imagine that if the Apollo client decided to imbue, like it started to recognize a handful of date types, then it would start to imbue those properties. And, if it saw one that was like a relative URL or a completely opaque jarbled up string, it'd be like, what the hell is that? We're not putting that in front of our consumers. So there has to be some like social agreement on picking these up for them to be useful by tools. So I do think that's like a second barrier for clowniness.
I think I agree with like the approach that this should just be I think that we say it's a URL and we're not enforcing it. The devil's advocate to adding it later is that I think adding this now is a non-breaking change, but adding that validation later would be. So that would be the one benefit for doing it now. It's not my preference, but.
You're definitely right. Yeah, it could potentially be breaking, but it actually might be the right thing. I think the thing that makes me the most nervous about adding that validation now is kind of to Andy's point. Parsing those and validating URLs is tricky, and there's like many variants of what a valid URI or URL is, and it might be worth letting it float in the wild for a while unvalidated to see what reasonableness is, and if some people are using things that are more URI like than URL, but we all kind of look at it in retrospect and say that's totally reasonable, then we could have an expansive version of validation. And we can maybe also kind of like, we'll keep a tight loop on this. Like if anyone spots anything that's particularly weird happening once this starts to roll out, maybe we can be reactive quickly with like blog posts or advice or something beyond technical validation.
Awesome.
Sounds like a plan.
I only rebased it earlier this week, but Ivan gave me feedback on that last night. I think I can respond to that later today. It was all pretty minor, just ordering of variables and things like that. So I think that will be pretty much ready to be merged. I guess, Ivan or Ivan, I defer that decision to you. But I think last conversation we had some questions just about, was this going to be a part of the 2020 spec? I think that was kind of dependent on the reference implementation. And is this going to be a part of V15, or was it going to be version of V15.1? So I don't know if we want to go into those details now, or if we've used up our 10 minutes.
I'd like to hold a firm line on what's in the 2020 firm cut of the spec. Also kind of knowing that from a practical point of view, people really track the draft more than they track the version cut. Just an opportunity for us to publicize it. So we'll let this be the first major piece to land in the 2021 cut. Cool. Thanks for your continued focus on getting this right, and for Yvonne for continuing to review it and make sure it's super high quality. I think the end result's gonna be really, really great. Awesome. Okay, moving on. Union fields, Sasha.
Yes. So this is maybe out of the blue, but this is basically an issue that's kind of come up a lot over the past like couple years. There's like some links there to sort of describe like what the issue is, but basically if you have union fields that have the same name but different types, you can't query for them. That's like not allowed unless you alias them. And maybe, as you can imagine, for clients, this is a little cumbersome because if you have like a lot of union fields, you have to alias every single one. So I guess I've kind of done a little research there, but I was just wondering, I kind of wanted to get like a clearer picture of like why the change was made to make it stricter. So I guess this used to be allowed, and then there was a change that was made, which is linked there. So like, I guess why the change was made and if it was meant to be made, and then like, I guess more kind of understanding around that. And if there is a possibility to move forward with like taking this restriction out, if that makes sense.
I'm going back through some of these links. This is for, okay. So you're querying the same field name on two different types, but in the same selection set.
Yes.
So
actually, like the return types must be different, right, Sasha? Like
yes, yeah, exactly.
To cause an error. If they are like
right.
the same scalar, they are okay.
Yes.
But if they're different shape, as the spec puts it, it gets an error.
Yeah, and a couple of the issues there sort of they have like little examples. I think this maybe has been going around for a little while, but I originally saw this in an issue in Sangria. So that's the original issue in Sangria is the one where I originally saw it. And then I have an issue that's related to that where I also asked the same question. And then the main issue with a lot of discussion is like the GraphQL JS version of all of this, which has been going on for quite a long time. But the Sangria ones have like pretty good examples. And then there's even a more recent issue that talks about this all again that has some examples too. So you can kind of see like what exactly we're getting at there.
yes.
This was a surprise when I encountered it too. But I think I had an issue that isn't linked here that Lee, you actually commented on and explained. But I'll see if I can find it and post it here in the chat.
Yeah, Mike, I heard that you were also looking into this and we're maybe thinking about an RFC at some point. But yeah, I've been like digging around and I just wanted to get like more of an understanding if like this is something that we could actually change or if it's like off the table. Because if it is, I would love to like start like looking into like making an RFC for it.
Yeah, I think I understand the problem now from looking through these links. The original concern, which we can talk about whether it's still a concern, is that the payload. So, for example, Sasha, I'm looking at the Sangria link where you opened it. So the payload of that object is going to have like an object with a single reason field,
right?
If one of those two types apply, And that reason field, then there's a question of what is the type of, response dot reason.
Mm-hmm.
And is it an A or is it a B? And you don't know because type name has not also been queried. So there's no way to differentiate between the two, which means if you're a strictly parsing client, you might not know how to proceed. So clearly that's solvable for some conflicts between, any type A and any type B, but it's not solvable for all types A and types B. So for example, if the reason in type A, this is like not going to fit the exact example, but if the first type was a custom scalar of a date, and then the second one was a string, or a custom scalar of a different type that also serialized to string, you get back this thing, and then the reason field is serialized as a string in the JSON, but now your client has to decide, do I interpret that as a date and try to parse it? Or should I interpret that as a string and pass it on as a string? Or do I interpret that as a URL if the other custom scalar was a URL and parse it that way? And if it chooses incorrectly, like it could crash. And if it might be both, depending on if there's like a list of these and it has to go through the list and decide which one is which,
Well,
get a list of these union types. So you can get into situations where your consumer does not have enough information to deserialize the JSON into local objects.
So one thing that I was like looking at this problem before, one of the things I was thinking about, Lee, was that the client is the one requesting the data in the first place, and I was trying to work through scenarios in which a schema change could could surprise the client with that scenario, because and I couldn't find any. That doesn't mean there aren't any, but if there are not any, that means that a client requesting things that are ambiguous is just, is requesting stuff it can't handle. It would just be required to also query for a disambiguator, right? Like a type name or whatever. And so I don't, if the assumption holds true that that there are no scenarios in which a schema change could could make a query that somehow becomes ambiguous, I think, at least in my mind, that probably is solved just by telling the client, if you're curious about this, like alias them separately, like fall back to the current way of querying, or request a disambiguator.
I see what you're saying.
The client, but also the client can always ask for the type name. I mean, if it's important to distinguish between the types in a predictable manner, the client could always ask for the type name.
Or alias, the two different ones.
Or alias it. Yeah.
And I guess that's sort of my point, and what we've been running into is that clients, at least from our side, are able to distinguish between these things, and so they want to query for these things, and then because it won't allow you to, they have to alias them, which is like, for them, they could just not in these cases, but they have to. So it's like really cumbersome.
I will mention though, solving this is only solving a very small portion of the use case, because you also, like the merge rules also have to do with arguments that are passed in, right? So like if I have created, and I have a format that say it's passes a string, right? It's returned as a string, and I am requesting it in like ISO format and then like some other format. Like those still won't merge, even though they're scalars being returned, because the merge rules would be difficult to.
That's a difference, because what you are talking about is if you're selecting the same scalar in the same selection set, but in this case we are selecting a field that has the same name from different types.
Correct.
You could
So
construct,
there's no merge rule.
You could construct an equivalent example with interfaces, though.
That's true.
You could construct an example with an interface and two concrete types implementing that interface. And on both concrete type fragments, you select the same field, but with different arguments. Those aren't going to merge.
But my point is, this is a different rule. I mean, this is a different thing, because In this case, it's about scalars, and the fields belong to completely different. Even if they have the same name, it really doesn't matter. There is no common interface.
I totally agree that this is a separately solvable thing. I just wanted to throw out that I originally encountered this following like relay patterns, right, where your components are specifying their fields, and they're composed together by these like higher level components, and so it's what I was hoping for, and the issue that I opened, which I couldn't link, is a little bit more like stepping back further and saying like, is there a mechanism to generically avoid conflicts in a way, or like somehow it was a much bigger ask than this. This is just solving one of the specific kind of use cases in a way that might be achievable here. I just wanted to throw out that this won't like just solve all conflict issues.
I just want to, chime in here and provide some additional context. So last year in the GraphQL Conf, Matt Mahoney actually had a talk about several different ways like client side can parse the response. And one of the ways is called the modular fragment models, which is aiming at solving exactly this problem where you have unions that have names that field names that are in conflict, as well as interfaces or their arguments. So in fact, at Facebook, we just group all of these problems, Mike, that you said before, like not only the specific union one, but also the interface one, and also the arguments to the interface, the arguments to the union fields. We just group them under a ugly name called fat interface. It's a ridiculous name, and it's definitely like been creating a lot of problems for us, because we need to, in order to prevent developers ever writing any conflicts, we need to do a whole schema validation, which is like looking across all of the types, whether you implement any shared interface or whether you are in like a shared unions, and then check that you don't have any conflicts, or if you have the same name, they have to be exact the same type. And that caused in like ridiculous like build time, or like we have to write tests that like takes 5 minutes to run or something like that. So it's definitely a problem for us. And Matt Mahoney in last year's GraphQL Conf talked about the modular fragment model and how clients can parse it in a way that doesn't rely on the fat interface behavior, or like you need to resolve the union names.
Oops, I was muted. Cool, I'll definitely check that out. Look for his talk here. Sorry, Sasha, I didn't mean to hijack your specific thing and broaden it. I just wanted to mention that as a side. We can continue going back onto the actual scalars.
Yeah, I guess I just kind of want to know like what a path forward would be, like if it is like just kind of looking at like all of this as a whole and being like, should we change this, or if like we can tackle this specific issue, if this is something we can change. I don't know. But yeah, this is definitely something that we have run into a lot at Twitter, and I did see Matt Mahoney's talk. It was really good. But like at Twitter, things move kind of slow. So like that's not always something that we can change. So if this particular thing changed, like that would solve a lot of our problems, and maybe like eventually we can change it wholesale. But yeah, I guess I wanted to get people's thoughts on like if this is something that we could change, because it seems like it wouldn't affect anything else. Like this is something we maybe could change, and then maybe we could talk about like if we want to like change things as a whole. I don't know like which direction to go, but what are people's thoughts?
I would be interested, did this only came up in the context of unions, or also interface with different implementations?
For us, it's only come up with unions, but I don't know about other people.
But with interfaces, it shouldn't be a problem, because you can just select the field on the interface, and it doesn't matter from which implementation it comes. It's just a problem when you have
if you have an interface A and two different implementations B and C, and they have the same field but different types, you run into the same problem, right? Like,
yeah, so it has to be, the interface doesn't specify that field, right? But the two objects.
exactly. Yes,
Yeah, that,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So
sorry,
it's the
didn't
similar
understand.
problem there.
It's-
Yeah.
Yeah. Like in terms of allowing this, one edge case that comes to my mind is like if you say this is allowed as long as the fields cannot happen at the same time. Like this question might be easily answered for union, but if you have like a hierarchy of fragments with type conditions, this condition I think is not easily answered. Like it might be tricky to actually force this into the spec as a validation. If you expand it outside of unions, or even maybe inside unions with a hierarchy of fragment definitions, it might be tricky. Like we had some edge cases around this in the past where the current spec doesn't capture all conditions. Yeah. I think that needs to be explored if this should be go further.
Hello, this is Greg. I think that this problem has a different, has another root to that problem. Since the spec allows to specify the same field multiple times in the selection set, there is a possibility that the field might be used with different values for the arguments if the arguments are defined. And when they got merged into the merged field, the only one takes precedence and the others are kept or ignored. And this is the similar thing with the selection sets in general, because in case the selection set has type condition on it, then technically those fields do not conflict because they belong to different selection sets. But within the same selection set, the fields with different values for arguments are definitely a problem.
That's definitely right. Just to back up a bit, I think this is one validation rule in a family of validation rules about how selection sets and fields are allowed to interact and overlap that solve two different but related problems. One problem is something that we certainly can't change, which is a server-side problem of, is the query unambiguous to run, which specifically is about arguments, right? If you see two fields with different arguments in the same selection set, you won't know which is the right one to run. And I think that was the first link, Sasha, that you put in there of the 5-year-old issue. Mostly talked about this. You know, if you see two fields that say, give me an image, one says size 100, one says size 600, you get your image back. How do you know what size it is? You don't. In fact, the server would have to figure out which of those fields to execute, and that can be ambiguous or at least confusing. So we certainly don't want to change that part. The other problem, which is related but different, is something could be completely unambiguous to run on the server, but ambiguous to the client, right? And that I think is what we're talking about here, where, you know, and for this particular example of the two different union types that both have a reason field, you get this payload back, and that reason field is going to be type A or B. The server had all the information it needed to appropriately execute the query, but the payload is now ambiguous to parse. So the historical context here is originally the expectation was that all validation would be done on the server. And so as clients wrote queries, queries would only, there was only one set of rules for whether a query was valid or not. And that needed to cover both the server being able to appropriately execute that query and the client being able to appropriately make sense of that. And then because of that historical context, it's pretty strict, right? Especially since at the time there was the idea of the fragment models or fragment interface models, which, you know, I think in one of these links, there's a little fragment of Java code that's, you know, simplified, but basically models the idea of exactly the kind of thing you can get yourself into, where you write something that, you know, might be reasonable for some clients, but for others would be a compiler error. And so we had one set of validation rules that covered all these cases. So I think what's reasonable and something that you could start to map out, Sasha, if you're interested in pushing this, is what starting to separate these two would look like. I think that there's a very specific question in the small, and then there's also a much larger question. So the question in the small is like, can we take this particular rule out? Can we decide that it's okay to have response payloads that are potentially ambiguous? And we say it's up to the client to decide to enforce that or not. Like a client could decide to alias these things if it doesn't want to be ambiguous, and like it's on the client to make the right query. And if we do that, then the bigger question is, should there be a tool or something in the spec, or I don't even know what it is, that describes this client-side set of responsibilities of validation? Right now, validation is like, it's a monolith. There's one thing that's validation. You could run it on the server, you can run it on the client, but it's the same thing. And if we start to tease these things out, we've kind of discussed this a little bit in the past. We've called it like GraphQL linter or something like that, where we could have these rules that we run only on clients, but not on servers. Then perhaps this rule doesn't necessarily go away, but it becomes an optional lint rule that you can put in place if your particular client relies on that behavior. That's kind of my thoughts. I hope that creates enough space to chart a path forward. The one last thing that I'd want to kind of highlight if you're going to investigate this is, I think the validation rules are not always perfect in isolation. They kind of assume that they're going to be run as part of this group. And in particular, the conflicting argument names, I don't think that it recurses. I think it just checks all of the current top level fields to see if there's a problem. And if there's no top level field problems, then it says it's fine. Because it assumes that if there are two fields with different types being returned, that's going to be illegal anyway. And so there's no reason to recurse. So you can imagine having one field that's interface A, one field that's interface B. They're different types. They both have a field that's like an image, one size 100, one size 500. And now like at runtime, you encounter an object that applies to both of those interfaces. Now you're back in the server ambiguity case. So we just have to make sure that we had unit tests in place that checked for all these like squirrely edge cases, and made sure that if we just like blindly pulled this rule out, that all of those test cases would still do the thing that we expect them to do.
Yeah. I messed around a little bit with at least the Sangria implementation of all this, and I sort of like noticed a lot of what you were talking about just now. So yeah, so I can see how like making sure that we kind of like, once we like pull this out, we kind of cover the hole with all more unit tests. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I have a question. I wonder how it is impacting the clients in general. If I have, let's say, a method or a field that produces an abstract type interface or union, and in reality, the server sends the concrete implementation of that interface or some union part. And then the client restricts that by specifying the fragments, fragment on one type condition or fragment on another type condition. And then when that data comes to the client anyways has to distinguish somehow which is which data applies to which kind of fragment specified. Isn't that the similar problem with what you're discussing right now, where the client has to know upfront, has to know what it is querying for?
Exactly. That's exactly the problem. Same problem. Yeah, these are, I mean, the specific issues here are talking about unions, but the generic problem is actually fragment spreads. So fragment spreads that have the potential to conflict or not conflict, can they have fields that return different object types? And what you said, Greg, is exactly right. You can get into a situation where the payload is ambiguous to the client. It was clear enough that the server knew exactly how to execute it. There was no ambiguity there, but the payload contained ambiguities, and the client can be in a position where it doesn't know how to interpret the results. I think the question here is that okay? Is it okay to put the burden of that on the client, knowing that the client could just like assume that this rule is in place and alias things, or there's many ways that it could get back to an unambiguous parse result. Are we okay loosening it, knowing that different clients have different requirements for this ambiguity? Some clients need very little information to disambiguate. Other clients need more. I think, I don't know if I have a strong opinion on this question.
I think the spec already has this provision for that. There is always a spec-defined field type name to also send to the client or request by the client the type information for this. And that should be a discriminator for the client to interpret the data the way it wants. So maybe we just need to say in the specs something like, in the cases like this, please ask for the additional type information and then decide what to do.
Yeah, I think that's basically like the main question here is like, that's how we ran into this. It's like for the clients, it ends up not being ambiguous because they're querying for type name as well and they're using that. So it's like, is that okay? And can we assume that that's what clients are doing? Or like, if they don't query for type name, then they don't know. And like, is that okay?
There is an interesting question here, which is, should we completely remove the client ambiguity sort of protections from the spec and allow this wholesale? Or should we have something that disambiguates, you know, like, and I don't know if, I don't know what the right answer here is, but right now we basically, we guarantee that the results will always be disambiguated, and like in a really strict way, like in a way that's so strict that clients are frustrated by how strict it is. We could say that you have to at least provide a response that is theoretically disambiguatable, like the information exists to disambiguate it.
Yeah.
But that also kind of assumes things about what a client can and can't do. And that might also be burdensome. Like maybe a client is completely fine with A or B, or maybe types A and B are themselves disambiguatable. Like A is a string and B is an int. And you can just kind of look at the JSON serialization and say like, yeah, I can tell that that one is not a string. So I know how to parse it. And you don't need type name. So part of me thinks that we should have some way, like you should not let a client write something that's completely difficult to disambiguate. But part of me thinks like, if we're gonna take this out, we should just take it out all the way. And like, if the thesis here is, you know, any rule that we put in place is gonna be frustrating for some number of clients, then maybe we should just like go all the way and not have any amount of client-side disambiguation rules in place. I think it's an open question that we'll have to answer.
Like, at least from my perspective, I think that would be okay as long as there is a way for clients to disambiguate on their own. So like if something comes back and it is ambiguous and like they need to disambiguate, they can like alias it or something. There's like some tool available that they can still like, you know, make it like non-ambiguous. But if that's not true, then obviously like that should be in the spec. And
yeah, I'm a bit torn on this one. There is definitely something to be said for forcing people into a path where they avoid shooting themselves in the foot as well. Because there's definitely cases where I can see where like people will end up writing their own kind of not quite correct disambiguation code in the client. And then, you know, the schema changes or, you know, some other value gets returned and suddenly they're assuming the wrong thing and it just leads to a bunch of bugs. Not necessarily a common case, but it is something that we avoid by being like very clear about this in the spec. Yeah.
That's true. There's a whole category of things that are like, we protect you against breaking changes in various ways. So we were talking before about like what kind of change to the schema could result in a surprise to a client and change a previously safe query that could be disambiguated on the client into one that could not be. I don't think there's any valid schema evolution that would do that, but you know, sometimes we have to think beyond that. And what are invalid changes to the schema?
Here's one. So to go back to your example of like, it's a string, or is it a custom scalar that serializes, the custom date scalar that serializes as a string? Maybe the string used to always be something that was clearly not a date. And then some user inputs a date into that field. And suddenly it's a string that happens to contain a date. And so it suddenly becomes ambiguous. Right, and I can see a client just like the client author not thinking of that case and not handling it and parsing it incorrectly and making bad business decisions on that case.
Right. So your thinking there is not that they would have taken some well-written disambiguation code, but they would have said like, oh yeah, sometimes it's a date, sometimes it's not. I'll like try to parse it as a date, and if it fails, then clearly it's not a date, and I'll treat it as the other case.
Yeah, clients would do that for sure if we give them the opportunity to do that.
I've definitely seen people write code that does that kind of thing, and face exactly that kind of issue. Yeah, that could certainly happen. I was thinking of something that was more like well-written disambiguation code. Like someone writes a query, one type could be a string, one type could be an int, and it says like, ah, cool, that's totally disambiguatable. I'll let you write that query, and I definitely know the difference between a string and an int in the JSON payload, and I'll do the right thing. And then later someone decides like, oh, that totally shouldn't have been a string here, that should have been a float. And they changed the string to a float. Like that's a breaking change in the schema, yes. That's gonna certainly cause some havoc, but this, like that could be an example where the amount of havoc it could cause is increased because like an intelligent disambiguating client had decided previously to let that query be valid, and now it's in a position where it like cannot tell the difference between them. These are all super edge casey, and they're like in the realm of things that people are doing that are bad engineering. But I do think it's worthwhile to think through like what are all the things that people who are going faster than they should go and making mistakes will do, and can we kind of put some protections in place to save them from themselves.
I'm kind of worried that we discuss it mostly from position of websites. On mobile clients, as I understand, like in Facebook, in some other companies, people use code generation, and like all these things in statically typed languages, not all of them have disjoint unions. So even if you have __ type name in response, like you need to generate one type per fragment. So like, and for the same field name, you cannot create union with like in most of statically typed languages, like probably Java and other language. So
Ivan, that's not true. What we do with our code generator is just using a marker interface in that case.
For client-side code generation, right?
Yes, because then the union is in C# is representable as a marker interface. Basically, you have a marker interface that has a union name, and both objects basically implement a marker interface. You can do that.
Okay. For the languages that do not support unions, we can introduce, or there are ways how to introduce the variant type that could be marked from the union, from the schema union, and that will follow various choices. So it is done before it could be done.
Okay, so my main point is I'm obviously not a Java programmer or C# programmer, so I don't know how it's handled, but I'm really interested in somebody who doing code generation for mobile platforms or working on.
I mean, I spent a lot of time writing code generation for exactly the platforms you're talking about. And that's exactly where that like 5-year-old issue came from. And it's why my first response was to spit out like Java generated code artifacts, because that's what I was working on at the time. And exactly the kind of setup that you're describing is kind of what we were working on. The original Fragment models for Android were Java interfaces where there was no ability to handle disjoint unions. I think if we were in a world where the very first clients that we were tackling were like if Swift had been released at that time and that was the first thing we were doing, we would have looked at it and been like, yeah, obviously disjoint unions, like that's how the clients will handle this. And we probably wouldn't have even put this rule in place in the first place. The reason this rule got put in place is because both our Objective-C client and our Java client didn't have a way to do these disjoint unions. And this was our way of protecting against that. But I think that the question here that's worth asking, and again, I don't know that I have a strong opinion on the answer to it, is should this be a spec rule that limits all clients, or should this be left to the client? Because I can certainly imagine a case where, and in fact, our code generators did do this, where our code generators would run validation first, and only if the queries involved past validation, then they would generate code. And that would protect us from who knows what kind of weird bugs down in the code generator. And certainly limit you from generating code that would produce compiler errors. But you could imagine a code generator deciding to add that logic itself. So, you know, it would say like, hey, you can't use two fields without aliasing them if they return different types, because I'll generate code that will result in compiler errors. And so even though the server won't restrict that for you, it would. I think part of the reason why we didn't make that distinction early on is we had this vision that tools like VS Code, other IDEs would have inline validation where you would get, you know, like yellow squigglies or something, and you'd highlight it and be like, here's an error, make sure you fix this. And it would give you that information on the fly. And if a rule like that was baked into your code generator, then it would kind of be late. You know, you'd like write all your code, it would look fine. You'd run your code generator scripts, and then it would fail, and it would have to, you know, do enough developer experience work to show you how to fix your problem. And that's kind of a lot to ask for a lot of people who are doing code generators, which is sort of why we favored keeping this stuff unified. That's some historical context, though, on why we did this. I do think now that we're in a position where our tools are much better built out, we can start to explore what it would mean to move this stuff out. It's part of the reason why I was raising that maybe there's a separate grouping of these, or like in the past, we've considered it like additional optional validation rules, the GraphQL linter, like how can we assemble this so that if you are using 2005 era or 2015 era Java fragment code generation, that you can like tell your IDE to please, you know, protect my coworkers from writing code like this by giving them helpful tools in line.
Cool. I actually have something at 10, so I can't stay much longer, but maybe I can, like, you know, take an action to kind of piece all this together and come up with like some proposal or not, and see where it goes, if that sounds okay to everyone.
Yeah,
that sounds great. I think your original question should be well answered of, is this interesting and should we explore this? Resounding yes. Where that goes, I think is open, but it'll be really exciting to see you put something together for it.
Cool. Yeah, and if anyone else is interested, just like ping me or email me or something, or find me in the Slack channel if you're interested in like helping or also looking into this with me. Cool.
Thanks,
I won't take up anyone else's more time. That took way longer than 10 minutes.
Okay, let's move on to the next thing, update on full Unicode support. Andy.
Yeah, basically, I'm just looking for some feedback. I put up a issue, I linked it in the agenda, where I kind of, yeah, laid out what I think is a reasonable approach to extend the spec and to allow full Unicode support. I put up a separate PR in the GraphQL.js repo, and GraphQL.js, similar as Java and Ruby and probably others, already supports full Unicode actually, but there were no tests inside. So it was like kind of an implicit, not fully official part of it, but it worked already in the way you would expect. And my PR in GraphQL.js just adds test to ensure that it works as intended, and one validation rule around how's it called? Give me a second. Exactly, around surrogate code pairs to avoid like invalid code pairs, which might be an edge case, but still. So yeah, looking for feedback or for opinions about it, how to move forward, because it's basically a cleanup. It's not really like adding a lot of new stuff, I guess, but the big change inside the spec would be like that we expand the range of allowed code points to full Unicode.
Does this cover all of the things that you want the expanded Unicode range to cover, or is this like a first step?
No, that's actually like for the full Unicode support that covers everything. It's like the actual change is just increasing the source character code point range to 10 for F. Like that's the major change, and then something needs to be done about escaping code points outside the BMP. So yeah, that's basically all of what I want to achieve at the moment. Yeah. It's a little bit like you put up previous PRs, Lee, where you kind of removed all restrictions in the source character to allow all code points, which led to some discussion around control character, which is reasonable. So it's really like, I think it's a sensible change, or I tried to make it sensible to kind of not put any more burden on anybody, for example, to deal with strange control characters. So it's a little bit refined version of what you put up 2 years ago. So I know it's not the most exciting issue, but it moves us forward a little bit.
No, yeah, it's important to get this right. I'm just taking a quick look at the PR to make sure I understand the full scope. I do think you should also address multilingual plain Unicode escape characters. I'll have to give a little bit of a closer look at the PR as you've written it, but I think right now it only handles surrogate pairs.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like we already have escape codes for everything inside the BMP. So like the only thing that is missing is like escape codes for outside of it,
right?
And this issue just adds it by allowing surrogate pair escapes. So it kind of leans on JSON and allows that you can specify code points outside of the normal range with 2 escape sequences directly after each other. That's a solution for as code points outside of the BMP. So I didn't want to add any new syntax. I didn't want to add any new way of for escape codes. So that's like, I think, the most minimal change.
Yeah, this is why I was asking if this would be the first step in multiple steps, or if this was complete. I do think it's worth having the expanded escape sequence, even though it does change syntax.
I mean, like with the six digits allowed, like what
JavaScript
does?
Yeah, the variable digit escape sequence.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I didn't want to put it inside there. That's definitely something we can discuss, I think.
Yeah, I think especially if kind of the thesis of this change is having like first class great Unicode support, the surrogate pair is really a it's a hack to take, you know, specs that were previously, or code that was previously not written for full Unicode support to expand to meet it. And the math to convert a code point into a surrogate pair is complicated, and
yeah,
it's
definitely
not something I'd like people to have to think about when they're writing.
Definitely,
code.
it's like it's like not. Yeah, like I guess there's a reason why people invented like the more convenient 6-digit escape codes to deal with this. The thing why I definitely added it, it's like this is how it already works at the moment inside GraphQL JS and for example inside GraphQL Java, and if you kind of take it out, you kind of like maybe have to deal with some edge cases people come up with, and I didn't see a reason to prevent surrogate code base. You know, like I didn't see a reason to say, you're not allowed to use them.
That's a good point. That might be going too far to say that you're not allowed to do that.
Yes.
But we should, I do think it's worth having the variable unit escape sequence in addition.
Fair. Totally agree that it's nicer.
I'd also love to see you turn this into a spec PR as well, just to kind of get a better sense of exactly what this looks like against the spec as well. You mentioned how the source character needs to change, and that one seems, you know, you just have like a little snippet in the issue itself. That seems super clear. I think that's probably right. But just making sure that all the various other pieces throughout that might need to change.
I'm happy to open a PR. I just want to get some feedback if there's like strong opinions around. Okay.
Anybody else have feedback on Unicode?
Okay.
So like you suggesting not supporting surrogate pairs, but instead supporting variable length, or supporting both?
Like my current PR suggests supporting surrogate pairs, and Liam said that we should, after this, looking into expanding it into the more natural 6-digit escape code.
I'm worried because JSON, as I understand, only supports surrogate pairs.
Yes, JSON only supports surrogate pairs, yes.
Yeah, so it would be surprise for a lot of people. They would expect the same escape procedure, and I think like people use the same library, the same functions. So like I'm for supporting surrogate pairs. Like JSON is dominating format, and it will not change in next, I don't know how many years. So having something which is look differently and you need to use different function to escape would be weird. I'm okay with supporting variable length in addition, but I think we need to support surrogate pairs just because JSON supports it. Well, because JSON doesn't support another mechanism.
I hear you, but at the moment, I mean, before your PR, Andy, we didn't support them. Is that correct?
No, actually, they were supported, but not documented.
Oh,
it's like the current implementation lies on the fact that JavaScript, like Java, uses UTF-16 internally to encode strings, and you just if you put two escape codes next to each other, it would be automatically converted into a surrogate pair. Like so, it's like it worked already perfectly fine. I just added code tests for it, so it was a very implicit, already full Unicode support working thing. And this is kind of my point. I just try to clean up things, and this was the most cleanup thing without breaking anything. So of course we could argue and say we kind of leave this implicit support, especially in GraphQL JS and others, in there, and just officially spec like the nicer escape codes, sure. We could also do this.
Okay. I agree. The surrogate pair thing I was on the fence about, but the fact that we already supported it implicitly leads me to think that we should continue to support it. And if we want to support it explicitly, then that's even better. So that makes sense. There is kind of an open question of whether we want to support surrogate pairs and escape sequences, since that's something that people will presumably be manually writing. I guess it could be the case that you generate those from something that spits them out that way, in which case we'd want to be able to consume them correctly. So I think that's reasonable. Cool. Hopefully this gives you good feedback to continue. I'm excited. This is much cleaner than my years old approach.
Okay, thanks. I will open a PR for the spec itself and let's see how it looks.
Awesome. All right. Next up is an update on input unions. Vince.
All right. Hey, everybody. So the update is that mostly there hasn't been a whole lot of activity lately. My role is changing at my job, so that takes up a lot of my time. Moving into architecture, who knows what that's going to mean. But Lee added himself as a champion for one of the proposed solutions, and I have a PR up adding myself as a champion for two, because I think two of them are good and should happen. And so I guess I wanted to just hop back in the meetings, get back in the flow of things, and then maybe see if anyone here might want to be an advocate, a champion for any of the proposed solutions. One of them was written up by Benji, the tagged unions proposal.
Yeah, I'm happy being a champion for that. I thought I actually already was, so I apologize if I haven't sent the pull request through.
No worries. And I put myself on that one too, because I think whether or not like another implementation happens, that seemed like a useful tool in the toolbox.
Are there any that don't have any champions?
Yeah. I think that they're sorry.
Anywhere we should be asking people to volunteer for being a champion, or maybe take the lack of a champion as a sign that they drop to the bottom of the list.
I'm looking at the doc now, and I know there's some outstanding PRs, so I'm not clear which ones are just pending a champion request. But I'm surprised that number 1 explicit type name discriminator isn't champion, so I'll take that one if nobody else is already kind of in the queue for that one.
That sounds great. I think there's a lot of strength to that particular one. Let's see. Yeah, I think some of them, I think we could take the signal that there's no champions as dropping to the bottom of the list. But I would like, if anyone has ideas about where to put out the call for this. I don't have a whole ton of connections to make that happen, but people here probably do.
I mean, I think this is the right group of people.
Okay, cool.
We can also open an issue for it, and just in case there's folks that aren't on the call who want to be a champion for one of these, but I think like 80 to 90% of your potential champions are here.
Okay, cool. So what's the job of a champion going to be here? Are they going to have to maybe present some case, or?
That's a great question. I think it's on us to to push on this a little bit. I think I've also been kind of slogged down by non-GraphQL work, as I know you have also, Vince. So you can share the blame with me for this not moving super fast. But
also me, sorry.
Yeah, of course.
No.
We'll eventually push this through, but it definitely requires a bit of our dedicated attention. Some ideas, we can see which of these ideas make sense. One idea is that we could have an out of schedule one-off meeting just for the champions alone, to kind of like hash through stuff, just so we can like, not worry about having everybody who may or may not care about the minutia of us fighting through the details. And then that way we could kind of come back with some clarity. We could do that async. To your suggestion of like presenting something, maybe we want to have homework before we do something like that by like going through. And Vince, you've done the vast majority of the heavy lifting of going through and writing up criteria and evaluating these various cases, but ultimately it should really be on the champion to make sure that these evaluations are accurate against their own feeling of how this could shape out. So we'll have to do a little bit of a refinement. Those are some ideas. I think the job of a champion is really to hold the null hypothesis. Like I want the champion to say, not like I'm gonna fight to the death to get this one done, but like I wanna, like, I'm excited about this one, but it's like on me to set this one down when something else is more exciting. And that I think is how we'll arrive at a clear decision that we're all collectively excited about, is when we can kind of make the clear case to each other.
Okay.
And a champion will say like, okay, I put down my champion card for this one and move. So I think just kind of knowing that, like, that's hard, especially since we've been working on this for a long time, and it's easy to tie our excitement to particular approaches. But if you want to be a champion for one of these, expect that to be like a moving position. You're going to move it from proposal to proposal as we figure this stuff out. But yeah, that's kind of my brain dump of ideas for how to move this forward. What do you think?
I wonder, and perhaps this could just be added as an agenda item to the next meeting, but one thing that I felt we can improve in the working group is the details around our processes and roles. As you bring up champion, and we're not quite sure what it means to be one. I might point to TC39's proposal process and how great an amount of detail they have. And in addition to that, what it means to be a champion and what it takes to move things from point to point in the process. I think that that's something that we could work on greatly here.
I agree. We have some guidelines for this, and certainly not as detailed as the TC39 has gotten. But we do at least have definitions for things like what a champion is and what the stages are. And here I'll post a link in the chat.
Thank you.
And I think, do we link this from the agenda? If not, we should. I can make sure. I'll update the template to make the link to this close to the top.
I don't see it in the agenda.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not there. I can certainly do that, because this document is really the place where we've tried to capture these things. One thing I think that we have learned is that every proposal has been a little bit different, and some proposals their course forward is really well defined, especially modest changes. You get like the Unicode one, I think, is a great example, where Andy is able to build full context, and the role of a champion is just like someone has to do the work and you sign up for that. And Andy's done that for Unicode. And I would say the majority of our changes look that way. But then a handful of our changes are much more ambiguous and complex, and where there's not even agreement on the problem statement, let alone the solution space. And for those, the champion role looks really different. And sometimes we need multiple champions when there's multiple proposals in the ring.
Yeah, and that's true. And the thing I like about the TC39 process documents is that it makes it very clear that in each step, for example, in this case, we would need to define the problem statement as a first step. And so if we had these kind of steps that it takes this to move it along, then at least that if anybody says, what does it mean to be a champion? They could look at this and say, depending on what the RFC is about or what stage it's in, this is the responsibilities. I think that'd be really nice. But I'll look through this because it has a lot of what I want, I think, and maybe I'll propose some changes.
That would be awesome. I will certainly add this to the template so that it's easy to find. I think this is the closest that we have. It's much smaller than what TC39 writes out, but it's the equivalent, I think, to what you're suggesting. And I would love suggestions. I think I've mostly written the lion's share of this myself. The origination of this document is actually thanks to Yvonne, who suggested that we well-define the stages, I think maybe 2 years ago. And so we've iterated on this over the years, but more than happy to take suggestions for how to improve it.
Awesome. Thank you.
So as it relates to the input union, I do like the suggestion to have a one-off meeting amongst anyone who puts themselves down as a champion for a solution, where we can dive into the nitty-gritty, which I think will be really great because some of these the proposed solutions have a set of variations and could probably like learn from each other in some ways and inform each other. So I'm a fan of that idea, and also want to note that more than one person can put themselves down as a champion for any particular one, I think, in this case, since that's a bit of a signal to me also that like if multiple people think that it's worthy. Would you agree with that, Lee?
Yeah, I think you're right. One small piece of clarification though is the role of a champion is really the person who's willing to do the work on something. And whenever you have two people who are sharing the role of champion, then if they're communicating clearly and well, then that can work really well. If they're not, then they can kind of look at that as a way to say, oh, the other person is probably going to do most of the work here, and then nothing will happen. So as long as we don't end up in a case where there's like an unclear accountability for who's going to push something forward, then we'll be in a good spot. If we want to talk about this as like champion versus
participant
or secondary.
Yeah, it's a little bit like some kind of sub champion, you know, like.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love for there to always be a single point person that's the primary champion, at least. But I agree, having multiple champions can be a really useful signal, and great way to have multiple people involved in the process too, if they care. Certainly, you shouldn't take the sign that somebody else is a champion for something as blocking you from being able to help.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we just need to give people a little bit of time to make sure those PRs for champions get in, and then schedule something.
Yeah.
So maybe we could try to schedule that in maybe 2 weeks, split the difference between now and the next meeting. I don't know how to.
Maybe 2 or 3 weeks from now. What might be actually useful is to do like 1 week before next month's meeting. Mm-hmm. That way we have a fair amount of time to work through that. I think there should be some active participation on this document in particular ahead of that meeting. And then we can use that to churn through a bunch of stuff. That way we can have a week to do anything follow up before the next of these meetings.
Yeah. 1 week exactly, we just put it on March 26th. Do we want to take actually figuring out a schedule offline?
Let's take that offline. Vince, if you don't mind opening an issue to discuss setting up a time for this. And that way there's like a place where anyone from this group or anyone who's on today's call who spots that wants to participate, they can kind of see that as an opportunity to jump in.
All right, I'll tag everyone who's currently there, and then other people can hop in.
Beautiful.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Cool. I got a suggestion to talk about deprecating directive arguments and input values before we jump into a deep discussion on defer and stream, since that one's fairly far along. Yvonne, do you want to give a quick update on those?
Yeah, so like last time Andy brought this up and we discussed it like a couple of years ago. So in a nutshell, we can deprecate fields and new values, but we cannot deprecate arguments and input fields inside input types. So, and like it's obvious omission. And a couple years, I think like a year ago, we agreed that fast forward actually this thing. And so I contacted original author and here based GraphQL spec PR and here based GraphQL JS PR. There is like some stuff missing in GraphQL JS. So right now I'm actually going through it and fixing small things, and like it's need a couple of more tests. So idea is always like, I think it's definitely more than a year. There is only one issue was raised about should we forbid to make deprecated arguments required, and the same for input fields. If input fields is required, should we forbid to make it deprecated? I actually think it's like it's best. Like I don't really want to add additional restriction on directives because it's not like automatically validated. In directives, you can just specify location and that's all. So for me, it's like you can. I don't see any big issue in being able to add deprecated on argument. For me, it's like linting rule. It's not like it's not something that breaks type systems. And this is only one issue. Everything else is kind of ready. I'm definitely, as we discussed, I'm not for inflating scope of GraphQL 2020. So it's like I'm totally for moving it to next release, but I really like to merge this PR into GraphQL JS. So basically move it to stage 2 and merge it into GraphQL JS so people start using it and discover issues with it. And discover, is it like a big problem, for example, if you can make required argument deprecated or not. So anybody have any thoughts about like this question about making required arguments deprecated, or like about with RFC PR in general? And I will send links to PR in the chat. So
just taking a quick look at these PRs, I don't think they're in a state where we could consider them a near final draft. So I think stage 2 is probably too aggressive. Stage 1 absolutely makes sense. I think we just need to, the GraphQL JS PR is actually looking in pretty decent shape. I can go through and add a quick review. The spec PR is kind of a mess.
Yeah, something happened. Probably a person, he didn't do, I can fix, okay, like, yeah, probably stage 1, I can rebase it correctly. I think he did the merge and then rebase. I actually forget to check how he made rebase. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think it's technical. Before that, I actually reviewed it, and it was in nice shape. So I think person just blocked it by doing rebasing correctly.
Here's a suggestion. We can go to stage 1 today, and then we could quickly raise this to stage 2 offline if these are in a good shape. Anybody on the call not happy with that plan? Anyone object? Cool. Silence is good, I guess. Yeah, let's move it to stage 1. And Yvonne, I'll lean on you to get these in a good working state. Once we have that, we can quickly move to stage 2 offline. And I trust your judgment on the reference implementation. I think it's totally reasonable to get that landed soon and start collecting feedback ahead of merging in the spec. So we can get that even in a release before we do stage 3. Cool. Anything else you need on this one?
No, I think that's all. And thanks for Andy, big thanks for bringing this up, because we actually forgot about this. It's not like it's one of these PRs that nobody opposed explicitly and everybody was happy about, but it just like nobody took a time to find it or raise this issue. So thanks for bringing this up in the last working group.
No worries. Thanks for doing the actual work.
All right. Let's talk about defer and stream. Who wants to kick us off?
Yeah, so I can start talking about batch responses. So basically, it's a problem that has to be addressed, that if the server dumps a bunch of patches really quickly, that could cause a client to re-render equally as fast as they're coming in, and that would probably degrade performance more than any gains you got from using defer. So we talked about a couple of ways to work around that. And the first one is that if we had debouncing on the client, that's like a pretty simple solution and doesn't require any changes from the server. But it's really hard to figure out what the right number is for how long do you debounce. And even in the best case, you're still going to add a little bit of latency for whatever that debounce value is. The server could also batch requests together, and instead of returning a single patch response, it could return an array of them. And I think that would mean that we would have to standardize in the spec that this could be 2 different types of responses that you need to expect. But you just also want to call out that the server should probably only be doing this if it has knowledge of how the responses are coming in, and it shouldn't just also debounce, because that would give you the same problems as debouncing on the client. And the other thing is, should we be treating defer and stream as just a hint that the server could choose to ignore? So it could, for each deferred response, could just decide that it goes into either the initial response or a patch that's coming before it. And so I think that we want to, we think that server batching and treating defer and stream is important, and we want to see if there is consensus if that should be in the spec.
Just to make sure I understand correctly, because it sounds like there's a handful of things being talked about at once here. One is about whether stream or defer directives are rules versus hints. Should a server be able to look at those and say, I'm going to ignore them? That I think is its own interesting conversation. My personal opinion is that it probably should be able to do that. The client is just saying what it cares about, and the server might say that the fastest possible way to resolve this is to do it all at once. But the broader discussion here, which is super interesting, is what's the actual response shape look like? And is it a stream? Can multiple pieces of that payload happen simultaneously in that stream? I do think that there's the lion's share of getting this right relies on like documenting and the abstract response format.
Yeah, if I could just chime in there, like it seems like an interesting question here is whether there's any value in being able to configure a server debounce, and whether that actually adds any value over a client-side debounce, because presumably it might involve adding complexity to the protocol itself. So you can stream with a debounce parameter, for example. Yeah, I guess I'd be interested in kind of like, don't have as much of a client context. I'd be interested in like what client-side implementers, kind of what constraints they're under. It'd actually mean a material performance improvement to move a debounce to the server. Presumably there's like the cost of responding to, at least in an event-based model, the cost of like responding to messages. I'm just curious, is that something that we see as important? I guess that's the main thing I'd be interested in, which is, can we get away without access to the protocol? Any client folks want to weigh in?
I can talk a little bit about how I saw this happen with an experiment that we did like years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And this was a pretty real concern, that if your server is naively streaming things and they're really tightly packed together, then you can get in a situation where like the performance ends up being dominated by React re-renders. That's a little bit of a specific React issue because of how React can often, a re-render can be expensive. For other kinds of clients, it might be less of an issue. So for example, iOS clients that I've worked on before that use GraphQL will actually stream responses into their database and then yield those back out. And so there's more of a observable style pattern in place, and the re-renders are significantly less costly. I don't know if recent advances in how React apps are being built mitigate some of those original concerns, but it's certainly something worth thinking about. There's an interesting question here, which is, certainly the server needs some flexibility in order to deliver things in an ideal order. And in doing so, the server needs to be doing not just what's best for it, but it needs to have some intuition for what's best for clients, even though that can be kind of broad. I don't know if it makes sense to say like, never give me payloads more than n milliseconds apart, and like the server tries to do its best to do that. For what it's worth, we tried doing a debounce on the client side for the React re-rendering problem and found that the performance was at best the same and usually worse, because it was really hard to know what the right debounce was. And the adding in of latency basically meant that we had to, we churned the CPU less, but the user experience was lowest common denominator in terms of response.
Yeah, so that's great. That's kind of the context I was looking for there. And so I guess really what we have is a bit of a challenge here. Like we've got to kind of, the server has some context. The value in having a server deliver batches, presumably, is that, the server may actually have certain chunks of work which are sort of generated together, or who knows, maybe even be cached. And so the server has some context the client doesn't have. And having some bulk or batch format that the server can choose to deliver it in doesn't seem like there's a downside there in giving the server the opportunity to deliver in a batch. The only potential downside I could see there would be I suppose, if you don't have a streaming JSON parser, you might be forced. Well, actually, no, you're just getting a string. So I don't really, I can't see the downside to having a batching format so that the server can make informed decisions about the granularity, and hopefully in many cases that like lowers the granularity and mitigates the rendering problem. With respect to the client, I mean, it's not clear to me what context could be sent up from the client to make that a smarter decision, like that's realistically available to clients, I guess. I would probably resort to debouncing or doing something, you know, more incremental, like essentially what React
yeah, at some point you get into the realm of trying to predict the future. And that's almost always when you know that you're in deep trouble. I do know that
right now. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I know that a lot of databases do have streaming APIs that work in the way that this like option 3 is describing, the batched responses. Actually, I remember Facebook's code base putting an abstraction in place that had like a chunked stream or something like that. That sounds very, very similar to what this is doing. So it sounds like there could be a very, very close one-to-one mapping between how a lot of backend APIs are starting to develop their streaming APIs with what we want to do here, which could be great. Like the case that I'm thinking of is kind of even beyond debounce. Like if you used a stream and on a list of things that had 100 items in it, and the server started giving them back to you 10 at a time, certainly we would not want to give them back to the client 1 at a time. We'd want to give them also back 10 at a time, because that's how the server's getting them back. And that would reduce at least that amount of unnecessary re-renders.
So that's quite convincing to me that we want some sort of batch format to be standardized. I guess, and actually I guess addresses my only remaining question, which was, can we like stage this? In other words, can we standardize a subset of this without the batch format and add the batch format later, from a perspective of simplifying the proposal? I don't know if that's a meaningful simplification, and it would be useful in a form in which you can do batching. If we don't think it dramatically simplifies the spec or make it easier to move the proposal forward, I would probably advocate for actually just standardizing the batch format. For context, we don't have a batch format currently inside of Facebook. Actually, she's on the line can probably speak to, I mean, in the end, I don't think this has been a significant problem for us. I think we have dealt with some re-render issues, but
yeah, we only experimented the batching format just for the stream and leverage exactly what Lee said about the chunked iterable, which is the database backend. So we haven't had like a global debouncing on the server side, which takes into account of all the different directives and all the stream. It is just for the streaming, and it is like purely leveraging the database streaming API.
And so just so I understand, when you say there's a chunked stream on the back end, this is like an iterator returning arrays, or is this an asynchronous iterable where each promise is like a separate term?
It is still an async iterator, but each of them, yeah. So from that layer, it's still async iterable.
Gotcha. And so we don't currently have a batch format, but I'm correct in saying in terms of the actual protocol for GraphQL side, there's no.
Yeah.
We'll set individual values. Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the direction I'm leaning here to, unless you know, anybody thinks it might make sense to separate that from the proposal and then do a fast follow on the standardization. Anyone have an opinion?
I don't think we should fast follow. I do think it's important, especially with a change as big as this one, that it comes out of the gates with all the tools you need to build a reasonably performant server and client that kind of like use the abstract tools described in the spec. We had to do something similar for subscriptions, although subscriptions does not have this kind of batch format. This kind of opens the question if maybe it should. I think I mentioned one of the last times we discussed this, that we should investigate whether we can reuse the stream abstractions that we put into place for subscriptions, and just see maybe there's like small changes we have to make to it for it to be useful in the context of defer and stream, that would be ideal, because it's just like fewer things we have to talk about, and it might help us start to see the similarities between these. Batch might be a case that ends up actually being useful in both contexts, but it's just like more immediately useful here.
Forgive me if this is somehow off topic, because maybe the fact that I haven't heard this discussed makes me think that maybe I'm misunderstanding the problem. But is server-side debouncing like not generally the solution to this? I'm curious about the use of batch payloads here, because in most of the cases that we've seen in practice, it's been very much kind of a last update wins situation. And so the server can debounce and just discard the old responses, and you don't actually need a separate custom batch payload.
So this matters in the case of stream, where rather than doing an in-place update of an individual value, you're actually streaming in a collection. So it's not so much last update wins. Does that make sense? So each individual.
So this is where it is functionally pretty different from subscriptions.
Yes, assuming a subscription kind of, and I is probably commonly the case, is doing kind of resulting in some sort of in-place update in the view. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and subscriptions, I mean, subscriptions are designed for real-time data, whereas defer and stream is not, right? So, which is why the batch is less relevant in that circumstance. Like the scenario in which multiple events would happen simultaneously, such that a batch is appropriate, is weird from like a real-time event processor. But in the case of stream, you might actually, like, all the data is there, it's just a matter of getting access to it. And like the simplest possible version is like, okay, you ask for 10 things, I'll give you one at a time. But databases might be more sophisticated and say, you know, I can actually give you a megabyte at a time. And so that happens to be 3 things. So here's 3 more, here's 3 more, and here's the last one. And if we're gonna do that from the database, then it makes sense that we should follow that through to the client. If we can process multiple things in a chunk, and then it's less the last thing wins and more that you have multiple pieces of data. You have to kind of describe to the client then, which is, I think, another piece of the puzzle that we've yet to kind of nail down for defer and stream, which is like, now that you have these streamed pieces, how do you reassemble them into a whole?
Yeah, the one thing that occurs to me where it might be useful for the client to provide an additional hint to the server, this is actually just occurring to me now, so it may actually be a bad idea, is along the lines of paging. Like one thing a client might know reasonably is its page size. Like in other words, the actual physical screen size of an individual view. And it occurs to me when streaming in, if I wanted to make an educated guess about how to balance CPU and latency, I might opt to tell the server to send me batches that correspond to page sizes. I mean, that would be, you know, in a smooth scrolling situation, I don't know how useful that would be. But I wonder if there's ever like a jagged scroll or like a left-right navigation, carousel style navigation. I'm reaching here. Just wondering if there's
I don't think you are. This is not a bad idea. This has some historical precedent. The original reason why defer and stream was prototyped in the first place is because our Facebook's iOS app for newsfeed kind of like hacked together a version of this, and like a ton of like science was put into figuring out what the batch sizes or like the page sizes should be. And there was like a final thing was like the first one should always be 3, because you can usually fit 3 stories into one screen size on a mobile device. And then after that, there's a bunch of science about whether it's like 1 next or 4 next or what happens there, where you can kind of stream in the other ones. But there was like a lot of like strong signal that 3 was the right number for the first size, regardless of what the server side could do. That one was like pretty tightly defined specifically for newsfeed. Like obviously other things are not going to follow that rule, but I think my first prototype for stream actually had an argument to the stream directive where you could specify some hints for the page sizes that you wanted. So I think there was some precedent in that old experiment to do something like that.
Yeah, and I can validate as well on Android through Cycler Views, which is like the smooth scroller on Android component. There are nice-ish properties when you are operating in page size amount chunks.
Yeah, actually, you're refreshing my recollection that we have done something like that. So apparently this isn't an idea I came up with off the top of my head. At Kuwait, though, can you refresh my recollection? Like today, because and this is maybe worth chatting about, we don't have, maybe we do it in the future, but we control a lot of these parameters on the server side through configuration, which has allowed us to avoid complicating the API itself. And in fact, that's probably actually, I think, probably interesting to folks who are exploring incremental delivery, but maybe haven't used it as much as Facebook, that we've essentially converged largely on a server-side configuration model, where we kind of, primarily because data delivery is hard to get right. And, you know, especially if you're in like a mobile release cycle and you're having to do client pushes to experiment, we're trying to essentially take those parameters out of the GraphQL query so that we can make modifications on the server side. And so that's one thing that we've explored doing, which I think might be difficult in a directive. Like we find like, oh, it's a batch of 3 and then a batch of 2 and then a batch of 5 or something like that. And that can be, you know, having that expressed in a directive might be a little awkward. But I think the larger point here is actually how do we enable aspects of data delivery, incremental data delivery, but even you could imagine things like page size as well. I don't want to get too far afield from incremental delivery to be configured on the server side. That's something that, you know, we're leveraging heavily.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. And just to add some like more context there, like a lot of the times, like you cannot find a static value that is always correct at every single time, right? Like the number might be 2 if it's like around peak time when everyone is using Facebook. You might just want to deliver some, you know, minimal amount of stories to everyone so that everyone's phone is rendering. But during like non-peak time, you might just want to deliver all 10 of them all together because not so many people are using it and the server is generally fast. There are definitely like additional advantage, even just in terms of like adapting to the timelines as well to be able to do the server side configuration.
Yeah, and so to summarize, I think what this speaks to is actually before we add things to the directives, it's probably worthwhile considering whether we can find ways to, because this has worked well for us. Actually, we've had some pretty big wins there. If we can find ways of simply associating directives with a label, or another approach we've used is actually we've rewritten certain GraphQL query parameters on the server prior to, which is actually perhaps a little bit more dangerous in the sense of taking potential control away from the client. In the past, of course, GraphQL, you know, the client is expected to control these things. But what we found, I would say the headline here is that while there's tremendous benefits in having the client specify what data, we found that there's tremendous benefits in having the server control how that data is delivered. And so that's the distinction that we've discovered. And so rather than adding parameters to stream and defer, wherever possible, we would, you know, want to see if that can be replaced by server-side configuration.
So
curious if that resonates with anyone else. Sorry.
It sounds like there's a couple pieces here. One is sort of a tension between client-side rules being specified versus server-side rules being specified, which I think might speak to the original point that was brought up by Rob and Lillian of whether they should be expressed as hints rather than rules. My sense on hearing all of this is hints is emerging to be kind of the right model that we think about this. Like clients need to say, here's what's important to me, and server, I trust you to do best by what I've expressed to you. And so the server could say like, I know more than you, so I'll do a better job. But we shouldn't go as far as saying the server or the client should not express these things, because then the server might lack the information required, or a server might not be that smart and like the client needs to provide that. A Facebook server is very sophisticated. Not everybody's GraphQL server is going to be as sophisticated. And falling back on just like the client says, I want it this way, and the server says, okay, you know best, I'll do it your way. Supporting both leads to a hint-based model, which I think could be reasonable. The other thing that maybe you can just kind of clarify, Jaffer, what you meant by this is something like a label. Do you mean that when you say, I would like to stream this, that you want to be able to say, I would like to stream this with the server-side known rules for how newsfeed gets streamed, and like have some label that says this is a newsfeed? Can you get that from the field name itself, or is that something that you'd want to like explicitly state in the query?
Yeah, I think the two approaches, and I'm happy to talk about the one that we took. I think one approach could simply be including a label parameter in stream, but in theory, of course, you could include it in any directive which controls how data is delivered rather than what the data is delivered, and then use that label on a configuration on the server side. The advantage of that approach is that it's somewhat safe in the way that the approach we have taken is not, which is we have actually sort of used directives to mark certain query parameters as configurable. So essentially, similar to the hinting model, sort of saying to the server, hey server, by the way, feel free to override this parameter if you feel like you can make a better guess at this. So this applies not just to whether stream and defer is enabled, but also what a page size might be, for example. It's an interesting approach to consider the what, how sort of difference here, and sort of use directives. If you think of directives as controlling how data is delivered rather than what. Today, that separation, however, is not so clean. And so the danger of this approach is that the server starts overriding query parameters that actually change what data is returned, which would be very bad and invalidate important invariants that we expect of GraphQL clients and servers. And so we've chosen the query string parameter approach, but I'm not necessarily confident that is the right one. When we move into the standardization phase, we're kind of like a closed world problem here. And it's also, it's important to consider we can do a lot more in configuration because we have a closed world. We have a set of applications which we support. So we can say, hey, these are the 7 or more likely, 1,700 different app mobile device configurations in the extreme, and have different parameters for them on. Whereas if you were GitHub and you were publishing an API to unknown clients, that might mean in those cases, you might want to have a more explicit API for specifying this information. So that's kind of the solution space that we've explored. And so that's why I tend to think that although I just a moment ago said that server-side configuration we found to be quite successful, it may, obviously, I think that depends somewhat on a closed world assumption.
It could go too far.
Sorry?
You mean it's successful, but it could go too far?
Yeah. I mean, when you have a limited set of apps to support, I think it's practical. When we get into, GitHub would be a great example here, public APIs, it may, just may not work. We may not get the configurability we need where we don't know anything about the client. They're truly a stranger.
So just to offer some of my understanding to what you just said, Jaffer and Lee, it seems to me that we've agreed on like the direction to go is to treat the defer and stream as a hint rather than this is the imperative thing that you need to do. However, the way that how do we achieve to make them a hint? One is directly through the directives themselves, i.e. you just make defer the deferrable, or you make the stream the streamable. And the other way is to actually say, hey, maybe we can use a combination of the defer and stream along with a parameter. And this parameter itself is configurable on the server side. So like maybe, the defer that you would have a label argument and you would have an if argument. And then if argument is associated with a variable on the query side that is, somehow annotated as this is something that server can tune based on all of the model, like sophisticated models that they have, as another way of achieving, how do we treat that as a hint, as a better like standardization across, different platforms. Is that kind of understanding? All right.
Thank you. That's much more cogent than I put it, Koei. Yes. In other words, in addition to giving the hint about whether the client can support stream and defer, it may actually go a long way to also, and I think this is orthogonal but related, give a hint to the server about which parameters could be overridden. That's kind of a more general mechanism for giving the server more control.
Robin and Lillian, what are your thoughts on this discussion?
Yeah, I think that we definitely agree that it should be a hint. And we worked on some implementation of that in GraphQL.js, where if the value is just not a promise, it shouldn't even try to defer it. And for batching, that's also pretty easy to implement based on async iterators returning arrays.
I'm a little confused. Were you saying, Koi, that we want to add like a specific label to denote whether we want defer stream to act as a hint or not?
Sorry, yeah, just very briefly, imagine we just have defer and stream, and then we have a parameter essentially saying whether it's enabled. So defer would have enabled : true, stream would have enabled : true, and then you could actually specify a parameter to the query, and then use that to turn that on or off on the client. The intention is not so, like that might seem a little silly, you could just not include the directive. So on its own, I think it's not really useful. I think when paired with the idea of having, of like saying, declaring on a query variable, hey, by the way, server, you can actually choose to override this value, then it's actually potentially useful, because once something's been deployed, on the server side, you can then go and say, actually, you know, defer doesn't actually improve our TTI measurably, and it uses up a lot of CPU. So we're just going to build a configuration on the server side and then run an experiment, for example, with 3 different values of turning on or off defer, different combinations of turning off, on or off defer in the same query, for example. And so I think fundamentally this is an interesting but orthogonal question to like stream and defer, which is like, hey, how can we hand over more control to the server? And what level of control can we hand over to the server safely? And it seems to me that that's the interesting distinction here: how data is delivered versus what the data is delivered. Did that make sense? I think cool.
Yeah.
So we want to control whether the server should or shouldn't support defer versus whether defer should be, whether it chooses to return it with the initial response or defer it based on.
Yeah, sure. And basically whether they choose to honor it.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, even if we didn't have, sorry, go ahead.
I think we found that both having an if argument on defer, where you could control it in the same query, was useful, where the client, for us, the client wants to reuse the same query for like a server rendered page and also like a client side navigation. And then on the server, we don't want to defer these fields, but on the client we do. So we would pass a variable to control that. So I think that's definitely useful, in addition to when defer is passed and the if argument is not false, then the server still being able to say that it's not going to defer that data.
So then to sum up, long story short, it seems like we should add, you know, whatever APIs we think are necessary to defer and stream, and not try and oversimplify them and rely too much on server-side configuration, because we always have some generic mechanism for overriding this on the server by variable rewriting. I'm not sure we want to sanction that approach. We just know that that approach works. That's something we've done at Facebook. So, you know, we know that option exists.
Yeah, and thanks, Rob, for pointing out the if argument is also useful if you just want to reuse a query or reuse a fragment that probably want to behave slightly differently based on the defer and stream.
Right. Would you say that the variable rewriting is more of an implementation detail of how the server is ignoring defer?
Absolutely. I think this is like orthogonal to the proposal fundamentally. I bring it up mostly just so we're confident we're kind of future-proof for this scenario in the future. This works for us at Facebook, so I feel pretty confident about it. So I think we can consider it separate from the proposal, the stream and defer proposal, and any parameters that might make sense to specify from the client, we should just include in stream and defer, and if certainly seems to fit the bill based on your use case.
So I'll do my best to sum up here. It sounds like, first of all, stream and defer likely need some arguments, the number of which is kind of yet to be determined, but we've identified a handful of use cases for places where the client needs to provide some additional information, notably if, which just like toggles that thing on and off, but maybe also an opaque label if a server is going to provide some specific functionality, maybe also a chunk size if the server wants to, or if the client wants to have some control over that. I think that's all in play. We can kind of work through what elements of those we want or don't want in the final version, but we should kind of be having them out in the open so we can figure it out. Another is on this like batching model. Pretty clear that that's going to be important. I think any reasonably performant implementation, experimental implementation of these in the past has had that. So we'll want some abstract description of what the batch streaming works like. It might actually be helpful, maybe QA, you can do something here, is I know Facebook has this idea of a chunked iterator, I think is what it's called.
It's called the chunk iterable, yeah.
Chunked iterable. Yeah. Which is, it's like a weird member of the family of like iterators and async iterators, and like I remember the first time I encountered it, I was like, whoa, I've never seen one of those before, and that's very clever. It sounds closest to what we're talking about here. Maybe if you could like find some way to talk about that outside the context of just hack in particular, that could be really helpful for folks to wrap their head around exactly what that thing is. Is there any other piece of this discussion overview that I missed?
I guess just to note that I think we want defer and its arguments, I guess besides if potentially, to behave like a hint. So even potentially chunk size, or I don't know, maybe we can still discuss that, but I think that's where we landed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll have to kind of noodle through exactly what that means across the gamut of things, but it could be everything from literally everything here is a hint. Like you say stream with all your crazy arguments and the server could decide, nope, single payload. Like I completely ignored that. Or it might be more fine-tuned. Like you asked for 3 things in the first batch and I gave you 4. But we'll have to set up some rules there, but totally. Yeah. I think letting this like careful dance between the client saying, here's what I want, and the server saying, I know better than you, here's what you get, is a careful one to walk, but we'll have to come up with a good answer for that.
Yeah, great.
So it seems like that the principle here is we would want to introduce like all these variables, but in the specification, we're not going to specify what those like arguments are going to guarantee you. It is just like in the principle of we think this is going to be helpful for any kind of servers out there, we're going to implement it.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Lee. I think you were actually saying that rather than necessarily a blanket sort of decision, oh, server's always in control or client's always in control, you thought that we might actually want to look at that on a per variable basis. The one example I can think of was the motivating example previously, which is if you're doing a stateless render, for example, like rather if you're doing a single step render and you're trying to disable stream, there in that case, there would be very little value in the server deciding to deliver it incrementally. And so there's a case where it's not non-obvious to me actually that the server should override your choice. But
that's a great point. That's why I'm saying like the general rule of the server being able to override seems like something that we need to take seriously, but we don't know the answer for what that means across everything. Sounds like in general, tweaking parameters might be okay. In general, taking something where you've asked for streaminess and providing less streaminess, whatever that means, might be okay. Providing more streaminess might not be okay. Like if you have not put @stream on a connection, and then all of a sudden this server decides I'm going to stream that to you, like you might be in a position where the client's not ready to handle that. So that would be a case where like you didn't even say to do it, and the server decided to like put something in place because it has control. You're right that like in those situations you could end up in a really bad position. So we'll have to be thoughtful in how we write those rules, and hopefully we can do it in a way that's not super confusing. I think like saying, here's how this thing works, except when it doesn't because the server overrides you, can be like a really frustrating thing to write down in a spec. So I imagine that we'll need to spend a lot of attention on like balancing between powerful and simple in getting this right, which I know can be tough.
Sounds good. So that's, I guess, action items for us to take away and sort of maybe put together kind of a matrix. If I was to try and establish a guiding principle at a high level, it would actually be give client control. Actually, the server should honor whatever the client specifies. This is just off the top of my head. But it should honor whatever the client specifies, with the exception of backward compatibility, where, like, for example, a server doesn't support stream or defer. This is my straw man. And then we could introduce a generic mechanism, not unlike what we talked about, which is explicitly marking query parameters as overridable by the server, and then essentially sidestep this question and provide a generic mechanism for server overrides that would apply to page size, et cetera. So that's
an interesting thing.
But anyway, that's my straw man. We can turn that around offline. I'm sure I'm missing some cases there.
Sounds interesting to explore. Cool. Anything else you all need to continue moving forward on defer stream?
I think one more missing piece is should we like try out to try to specify some of the batch format going forward? Because it seems like what I take from this discussion is we would definitely still want to consider batch, like not skip it at this point.
Yeah. My suggestion is take a look in the spec at how subscription streams are specified. They're done in a way that does not rely on JavaScript or JSON or iterables or anything like that. It describes a subscription stream in a very abstract way that's still directly applicable to the world of iterators and async iterators as we know them. And I think the goal would be to write something equivalently abstract that handles all the scenarios we need it to handle, which if you go look at what's written up in the spec, it's like 20% describing the details and 80% showing examples and like explaining in English how that thing should work, which we'll probably need to do something similar to. I do think a first step is taking the chunked iterable and like extracting it from the world of hack and like describing it in the abstract. I think that'll be a good first step. And we'll start to see how much of that thing is relevant and we need to keep and how much of it is in the weeds details that we can kind of abstract away.
Yeah, that sounds good. I can definitely take a stab at take a look at the chunk iterable and how to describe that behavior in a more language agnostic way.
Yeah, I just want to comment that may actually be overgeneralizing in this particular case. I think what Kuei was alluding to was like, rather than sort of trying to talk about a chunk iterator, which might be useful for future concepts, but because we don't have this concept in subscriptions today of like a batch of subscriptions for the reason we called out earlier, it may just mean another payload format, another response format, would be my intuition about the best way to handle this. But still, I think we'd want to leverage this concept of streams that are introduced by subscriptions to talk about incremental delivery in general. Does that sound rightly?
I think you might be right. That's what I mean by saying like, let's abstract this down and look at how much of it needs to be in there versus not. Like the goal is always the simplest possible, because the simpler it is, the more flexible it can be. It can describe more things. So really like what we're trying to match is consider what an implementation would look like in, you know, N+1 languages, and then what's common amongst them. And as you start to, like, that is what the spec should be. And it needs to be detailed enough that it covers the things that you want to guarantee, but general enough that it doesn't restrict those clients from doing the thing that they need to do. So Jafar, you might be right that maybe this chunked detail is actually an implementation detail. Maybe these are just straight up streams, and like there's an implementation detail that like sometimes you get a lot of these stream events all at the same time, and then like clients are totally happy to you know, do a single render in that scenario. That's like an area that we'll have to kind of fiddle with it and see what makes the most sense, because we ride that line between not giving enough guidance to clients to understand how to interpret the results and giving too much to the point where we're restricting them. there is like at some point we do also have to make recommendations on how this stuff serializes. We do that in the spec. We say like, hey, you don't have to use JSON, but if you do, like, here's the serialization rules you should follow. We'll probably want to do something similar. And so like if we want these to look like multiple payloads that happen really fast one after another, that implies client-side debouncing. If we want these to look like payloads of arrays of events, then that implies no client debouncing. And so there's the rub. I think like that's where we'll have to figure out exactly how detailed that we need to be in order to make sure clients can make sound decisions. Because it would be really a bummer if like different servers took different approaches to that particular question. Then clients would not have the information that they needed, the guarantees that they needed to like write a single network protocol.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, honestly, I think in this case, I just was probably prematurely optimizing. I was thinking instead of like a full payload and an individual value, we needed like a third. But actually, I think maybe the chunked iterator is actually the right model here and is more flexible because you can just say, hey, an array. I'm probably prematurely optimizing, thinking of some third way where we didn't have to like have all the arrays of paths. So yeah, let's start with the simple. I think that's the right approach.
Well, even if that's an array, that is still a break from the response format that the specification specified today, right? It's going to be something we would want to like write up for,
Yeah, I think though, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Lee's point is that like then we have a more general chunk concept, which we could theoretically use in future stream. We wouldn't have to essentially reinvent that concept.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Chunked iterator of T, so to speak.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. So I think we have some takeaways, action items to move forward with. Thanks very much for feedback.
Yeah, Jaffer, I don't know if you were in the earlier chunk of the meeting. I think at one point Lee was recommending for another topic that we would have a work group specific one, like 1 week prior to the monthly scheduled. I think your topic of lazy versus async would be a good candidate for a separate like topic specific work group. Should we also like aim at schedule that before like next month's working group?
Yeah, sounds good to me. And just for brief context for folks, async, both async and defer are essentially like asynchronous, but they have to be delivered. And there's another option there, which is like we could wait for a client signal before delivering them. And that's primarily beneficial for situations where you're like optimistically preloading for like the next view, for example, because at peak time, you could decide to not eagerly deliver the data and wait for laziness. That's the short answer. So anybody who's interested in chatting about that, there's an issue that I'll actually link into the chat that I opened. Didn't get much traction on, so I'm not sure how interested folks are. It's really more about future-proofing async and defer and being confident that we can actually move forward without worrying about laziness, and we can add it on later on in a composable way. So I'll post that issue in the group, and anyone who's interested, we can have a breakout session to discuss it.
Sounds good. I'll leave it to you all to schedule a pre-working group meeting if you guys decide that it's useful to do so. Awesome. That's our full agenda for the day. Anything else come up that anybody wants to cover in the last few minutes? Silence is golden. Cool. Well, I will give back time to everybody for the remainder of this session. Thanks so much. We covered a ton of ground. Super excited to see all these proposals move forward. And see you all here, same time, same place next week or next month.
All right. See you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.